The desert wind was howling through Palm Springs when Sam Giancana's black Cadillac pulled up to Frank's compound gates. It was April 1975, and nobody, not even Frank's security detail, was expecting Chicago's most notorious businessman to show up unannounced at the chairman of the board's private sanctuary. But what Frank didn't know was that his oldest friend had come to collect on a debt that was 30 years in the making. The intercom buzzed at exactly 4:17 p.m., interrupting Frank's afternoon rehearsal session with his piano player. Through the static came a voice that Frank hadn't heard in person for 3 years, not since their bitter falling out over a business deal gone wrong. "Open the gate, Francis. We need to talk." Sam's voice carried the same quiet authority it had possessed since their early days together, when they were both young men hungry for respect in a world that gave it only to those who took it by force. Frank's hand hesitated over the security release button. The compound's cameras showed Sam standing alone beside his car, no bodyguards visible, wearing a simple gray suit that made him look more like a retired insurance salesman than the man who had once controlled half of Chicago's underground economy. But Frank knew better than to trust appearances when it came to Sam Giancana, the man who had helped launch Frank's comeback in the 50s, who had smoothed the way for his Hollywood connections, who had been like a brother to him through the Kennedy years, was also the most dangerous person Frank had ever called a friend. "Let him in," Frank told his security chief, a former FBI agent named Murphy who had been watching over the compound since Frank's retirement from the touring circuit. Murphy's expression showed he didn't like the decision, but he'd learned long ago not to question Frank Sinatra's judgment when it came to old friends and older debts. The walk from the gate to Frank's house took exactly 3 minutes. Frank had timed it once during a paranoid phase in the late 60s when every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Today, watching Sam's familiar figure move slowly up the palm-lined driveway, those 3 minutes felt like 3 hours. Frank used the time to pour himself a Jack Daniels and to remember a conversation they'd had in 1960, when Jack Kennedy was running for president and the world seemed full of possibilities for men who knew how to play the game. "You're going to have to choose sides someday, Francis," Sam had warned him back then, sitting in this very same living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the desert. "When that day comes, you better remember who your real friends are." Frank had laughed it off at the time, confident that he could navigate between worlds: Hollywood and politics, entertainment and business, respectability and the shadows where real power lived. The doorbell's chime echoed through the house like a funeral bell. Frank opened the door himself, something he hadn't done in years, and found himself face to face with the man who had shaped the last 3 decades of his life in ways both wonderful and terrible. Sam looked older, grayer, but his dark eyes still held the same calculating intelligence that had made him one of the most feared men in America. They stared at each other for a long moment, 30 years of shared history passing between them like ghosts. "Hello, Sam." Frank's voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. In their world, showing weakness, even to an old friend, could be a fatal mistake. "Hello, Francis. You look good. Retirement suits you." Sam's smile was thin, not reaching his eyes. "Mind if I come in? The desert air isn't good for old bones like mine." Frank stepped aside and Sam walked into the house he had visited dozens of times over the years, for birthday parties and business meetings, for celebrations and conspiracies. But today felt different. Today felt like an ending. The living room where they settled was a monument to Frank's success. Gold records on the walls, photographs with presidents and movie stars, awards and accolades from a career that had spanned 4 decades. But Sam barely glanced at the trophies, his attention focused entirely on Frank as they sat in the leather chairs where they had once planned ventures that changed the course of American entertainment and politics. "You've been avoiding my calls, Francis." Sam's tone was conversational, but Frank could hear the steel underneath. "That's not like you. We've always been able to talk through our problems." Frank sipped his whiskey, using the gesture to buy time. The truth was, he had been avoiding Sam's calls for months, ever since the newspapers started reporting that federal investigators were closing in on Chicago's old guard. Frank's own FBI file was thick enough to choke a horse, but he had always managed to stay one step ahead of serious legal trouble. Sam, on the other hand, was facing the kind of heat that could put a man away for the rest of his life. "I've been busy, Sam. You know how it is in this business. Always another project, another commitment." The lie came easily to Frank's lips, polished by years of navigating dangerous conversations. But Sam had known him too long to be fooled by casual deflections. "Cut the bullshit, Francis. We're too old and we've been through too much for you to play games with me now." Sam leaned forward, his voice dropping to the whisper that Frank remembered from their most serious conversations. "I know you've been talking to people, federal people, people who ask a lot of questions about old times and old friends." Frank felt his chest tighten. This was the conversation he had been dreading for years, the moment when his two worlds, the legitimate entertainment empire he had built and the shadow network that had made it possible, finally collided in a way that couldn't be smoothed over with charm and carefully chosen words. "I don't know what you're talking about, Sam." Frank kept his voice steady, but his grip on the whiskey glass tightened imperceptibly. "I've never talked to any federal agents about anything. You should know me better than that." Sam's laugh was dry, humorless. "Should I? Because the Francis Sinatra I used to know wouldn't have left his friends hanging when things got complicated. The Francis I knew understood that loyalty was a two-way street, that when someone helped you climb the mountain, you didn't forget them when you reached the top." The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke. Frank had heard similar words before from other friends who felt abandoned when his rise to respectability required distance from his past associations. But coming from Sam, they carried extra weight. Sam had been there at the beginning when Frank was struggling to rebuild his career after the vocal cord problems nearly ended everything. Sam had opened doors, made introductions, and asked for very little in return, just friendship, loyalty, and the occasional favor that Frank had been happy to provide. "You helped me, Sam, and I've always been grateful for that. But gratitude doesn't mean I have to go down with the ship when the waters get rough." Frank stood up, walking to the window that overlooked his swimming pool and the desert beyond. "We're not kids anymore. We both know this game was always going to end eventually." "End for who, Francis? For me, or for all of us?" Sam's voice followed Frank across the room, carrying 30 years of shared secrets and mutual dependence. "Because if I go down, a lot of other people are going to fall with me. People who might have thought they were insulated from the consequences of their choices." Frank turned back to face his old friend, and for the first time since Sam's arrival, he allowed some of his real feelings to show in his expression. "Are you threatening me, Sam? Because if you are, you should remember that I'm not the same struggling singer you helped out all those years ago. I've got resources now, protection, people who owe me favors. And I'm not the same neighborhood tough guy who used to smooth your path through Chicago's nightclub scene," Sam replied quietly. "I'm a man with nothing left to lose, Francis. And that makes me more dangerous than any resources or protection you think you've got." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Frank had seen Sam use the same tone with business rivals and political enemies, a calm promise of consequences that was somehow more terrifying than any shouted ultimatum. But Frank had survived 30 years in entertainment and politics by never backing down from a confrontation, even when the stakes were this high. "So what do you want, Sam? Why are you really here?" Frank returned to his chair, settling back with the whiskey glass cradled in his hands. "Because if this is just about old times and friendship, we could have had this conversation over the phone." Sam was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying Frank's face as if memorizing every detail. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a sadness that Frank had never heard before, the weariness of a man who had spent a lifetime building an empire only to watch it crumble under the weight of changing times and federal scrutiny. "I want you to remember who you used to be, Francis. Before the awards and the presidential friendships and the respectability, I want you to remember when we were partners, when we trusted each other with secrets that could destroy us both." Sam leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxing slightly. "And I want you to decide whether that man still exists or if he died somewhere along the way to becoming Frank Sinatra, American icon." Frank felt something twist in his chest, a mixture of guilt and defiance that he hadn't experienced since his early days in Hollywood, when every choice felt like it could make or break his entire future. Sam was asking him to choose between his past and his present, between loyalty to an old friend and protection of everything he had built since those early days when survival required different kinds of alliances. That man you're talking about, Sam, he made some hard choices over the years. Some of them hurt people I cared about, including you. But he always did what he had to do to survive in a world that didn't give second chances to people like us. Frank set down his whiskey glass, the crystal making a sharp sound against the marble coffee table. The question isn't whether that man still exists. The question is whether you can accept that he learned to evolve with the times. Sam nodded slowly, as if Frank's answer was exactly what he had expected to hear. Evolution. That's one way to put it, I suppose. Another way would be to call it betrayal of everything that made you who you are. He stood up, straightening his jacket with the same careful attention to detail that Frank remembered from their earliest meetings. But you're right about one thing, Francis. We're not kids anymore. We both know how this game ends. Frank walked Sam to the door, their footsteps echoing in the marble foyer that had witnessed so many important conversations over the years. At the threshold, Sam turned back one final time, his expression unreadable in the desert twilight that was beginning to settle over the compound. Do you ever wonder, Francis, what would have happened if we had stayed loyal to each other? If we had faced whatever came together like we did in the old days? Sam's question was barely audible over the evening wind that was picking up across the desert. Do you think things might have turned out differently for both of us? Frank met Sam's gaze directly, drawing on reserves of strength that had carried him through 4 decades of public scrutiny and private battles. I think we both made the choices we had to make, Sam, and I think we're both going to have to live with the consequences, whatever they turn out to be. Sam nodded one final time and walked back toward his Cadillac, his figure becoming smaller and more indistinct as he moved away from the house lights and into the gathering darkness. Frank watched until the car disappeared through the compound gates, then closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of 30 years of friendship and betrayal settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. 3 months later, Frank learned about Sam's death from a news report on television. The Chicago businessman had been found in his basement kitchen, killed by persons unknown while he was cooking a late-night meal. The investigation would never be resolved, the perpetrators never identified, but Frank understood the message that Sam's death was meant to send to everyone who had ever been part of their world. Some debts, Frank realized as he watched the news coverage, could never be fully repaid. Some friendships, once broken, could never be mended, and some choices once made echoed through the years with consequences that reached far beyond anything the decision-makers could have imagined. But in the strange mathematics of loyalty and survival that governed their world, Sam Giancana's death also represented a kind of resolution. The last direct link between Frank's past and present had been severed, allowing him to move forward into whatever years remained without looking over his shoulder for shadows from Chicago. Frank Sinatra had always been a survivor, and he had learned long ago that survival sometimes required sacrifices that cut deeper than any physical wound. Sam's final visit had reminded him of that lesson's price, but it had also confirmed something Frank had suspected for years. He was strong enough to pay whatever cost his choices demanded, even when that cost was measured in the lives and loyalties of the people who had once meant everything to him. The chairman of the board had protected his throne, but like all kings, he would have to live with the knowledge of what that protection had required. In the desert silence of his Palm Springs compound, surrounded by the trophies of a legendary career, Frank Sinatra settled into the loneliness that was the inevitable price of ultimate survival in a world where only the strongest and most adaptable could hope to endure. The game was over and Frank had won, but victory, he discovered, tasted remarkably like ashes in the mouth of a man who had once believed that friendship and success could coexist without destroying each other. Some lessons, Frank realized, were more expensive than others, and some victories were indistinguishable from the deepest kind of defeat. This final meeting between two legends would remain one of the most closely guarded secrets of Frank Sinatra's life, A conversation that revealed the true cost of power and the impossible choices that shaped an era. The question that haunted Frank until his own death was whether he could have changed Sam's fate or if their tragic ending was always inevitable from the moment they chose their different paths. If this untold story of loyalty and betrayal moved you, show your appreciation with a like, because some friendships deserve to be remembered even when they end in shadows. What do you think? Was Frank right to protect himself, or should he have remained loyal to Sam until the end? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden stories from the golden age of entertainment, where every friendship had a price and every choice carried consequences that lasted a lifetime.